If you don't mind, let's just level settle for a minute here. I feel like if I think about security, the way we approach it all these years, it's very reactive. It's very, let's play whack-a-mole. There's a new attack. There's a new vulnerability. We're going to go fix this issue. Can we be better than that? Is there a different way of thinking about security at this point, and where are we on that maturity curve?
I don't know if I have a great answer to that, because I feel like security, like any technology, part of the tech industry, is always chasing the future, right? Like I'm not at OpenAI. I'm not setting the future of artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. It's very hard for us to get in front of what is next. We're still fighting the last war in terms of, we know what risks are today. And we know we're not doing a perfect job of those things that have impacted us for a long time. To get in front of what's happening tomorrow is almost an impossible ask. I feel like I realize you're looking for a more positive feeling than that, but I'm a security person. I'm not positive.
Well, let's just kind of dive into the day-to-day existence of the average cybersecurity person. And we see attacks all the time. I don't feel like they're especially sophisticated attacks. I mean, there are clearly ones that are, done by some nation state somewhere, but the bulk of it seems to be highly automated. Variations on a theme, tactics and techniques don't seem to be that complicated. What seems to have changed is, we're just trying to defend a broader and broader attack surface all the time. So is it just an attack surface issue at the end of the day that we're not quite prepared for? And what do we got to do to get in front of that?
Can you hear me? I'm getting error messages from the. Okay. Cool. To the attack surface thing, yeah. Well, I feel like that is. I think at the core of your point there is, we're not doing a good job of the things that were impacting us yesterday. Really simple things like phishing and lots of vulnerabilities that we've known about for decades. And also, we're trying to straddle what's happening today, like the new things that we're trying to protect. And then you're also, pointing out that we need to start thinking about what's happening tomorrow. So I feel like that attack surface thing is maybe the core issue. We don't have a good handle on everything that we need to fix today. There's this ever increasing amount of things that we need to worry about. And maybe if we just started at the very simple things that were impacting us 10 years ago and worked up from there, we'd have a better job, stop script kiddies hacking our websites and stop people phishing. If we deployed MFA everywhere and got rid of username, password, logins everywhere, then phishing wouldn't be a problem. If we had modern websites that had done away with SQL injections that have been known about for like 20 years plus, then we would have stopped script kiddies hacking our website. So I guess to your point, we need to know the full total of things that are impacting us, but maybe we should be doing a better job at the meat and potato basic things, rather than worrying about things like AI and the other things coming down the path. Yeah.
Do you think the bad guys kind of laugh at us a little bit because, we get so obsessed about the latest and greatest vulnerability that might impact us on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon if the following 37 conditions are met? And they're probably sitting there going, let's just kind of crank out the same attacks over and over again until we hit something.
I think they're not laughing at us. They're too busy making money. But no, I think that there is a degree of humor in the fact that the very simple things work, particularly when you're leveraging them at scale. But on the flip side, it's very asymmetric, right? Like as a bad guy, I just need to go find that one company that is badly configured because of some VM backup software. I don't need to worry about like specific individuals or specific companies. It's very asymmetric. There's a whole internet out there. I just need to find one or two instances of things that I can attack. Whereas on the flip side, heads of security, people working in the security field have a very specific, there's 500 people working in this company. They're all doing things every day that could be increasing the amount of risk. I need to figure out how I can get a handle on that and start attacking it. or making it better, basically.
How do we make vulnerability management better? Because so often we don't update a piece of software to go address a vulnerability. I think we're afraid that it's going to break, but we seem to have thousands of vulnerabilities running around. And how do we kind of get our arms around this whole thing?
So yeah, vulnerability management is a tough one because it's not, and like many things. Hang on a sec. I think my video feed is. To answer your question about vulnerability management, vulnerability management, like many things in security, it's not just a technical problem, right? You've got a piece of security technology. It's trying to assess all of your software, your web infrastructure, your physical infrastructure for vulnerabilities. You find a whole bunch of, you find thousands of high impact vulnerabilities. And then as a security person, what happens next? Somehow you need to find who owns these assets, how to get them to address those concerns. So it's not only do we need to be security people and experts in technical risk, we now need to be experts in how to win friends and influence people and get them to make the fixes that we need. So it's very much about like the split of responsibilities. Security teams might be responsible for those vulnerabilities. Maybe they're just responsible for finding them and keeping the program of vulnerability management up to date and making sure that it's running like clockwork. But at some point, someone is going to have to address those vulnerabilities, and it's typically not within the power of the security team to do that. So I think that's the inherent conundrum in vulnerability management, which is we know about these things, we've got all this data, but we're not empowered necessarily to make those changes, and we need to find ways of doing that. On top of that, vulnerability management is often a very theoretical exercise, right? Like from a tool point of view, it says you may or may not have a terrible, scary vulnerability in this piece of software or this cloud resource or this network device. Often you don't have a full picture of like, is it really an issue? Does it really impact us? What's the actual likelihood that a bad guy could use this vulnerability to get to something that is worthwhile? So there's this game of like, I think this could be a real thing. I don't really have the time. I can't be an expert in every type of technology and tool that we use. So there's this game of like, here's all these things that we're concerned about. Like, what are the real things? Where do we spend our time? How do we convince people to address those issues? And yeah, so vulnerability management is tough.
Do we need to have an adult conversation about vulnerability management? Because I feel like the security people should be able to fix low-level vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities, at least at endpoints, that clearly the odds are that something going to break is limited versus, say, a vulnerability in a Java application running on a server somewhere that is custom made. That might be a whole other conversation. But, can we kind of separate these things and start figuring out that not all vulnerabilities are of equal weight and value?
Yeah, I think to your point, there is a conversation to be had there, but it's complex and nuanced, right? There's often criticisms of security teams that are just breakers, right? Like they're running tools, they're doing pen testing, they're doing red teaming, they're embarrassing the organization and proving that there's all these security vulnerabilities out there, but they're not necessarily making the story better. They're not necessarily moving the organization to a more secure posture. And then there's the conversation around builders, security teams that are building out infrastructure, laying tools and laying processes that get rid of whole classes of vulnerabilities. So I think if you're thinking about a mature security organization, it would be good to start moving towards a place where the security team is actually making things better rather than just running a list of vulnerabilities and telling the business that they've got problems. But I think in reality, that's a really difficult problem, right? Like the thing that you're talking about, like can the security team just push out a fix? That sounds great, but like, who is going to be paged at 2 a.m. on a Friday night when things go wrong because of the update that we pushed? There needs to be operational responsibility for whatever system that you're talking about, whether it be software running on laptops or cloud infrastructure or physical networking devices. So it's always going to be a mix of priorities, who's resourced to do what, who's got the actual ability to understand the complexity. And I don't think there's a simple answer, really.
Yeah. Do we need more accountability, though, to your point? And I'll give you this example. Let's say it is a complex server application and somebody sends over a list of vulnerabilities. Two things invariably happen. The developer first says, well, no, none of that stuff is actually running in the production environment. And then secondarily, they'll say, and it's not internet facing. And then it'll turn out that in both counts, they're wrong. So how do we kind of have that conversation with those people? Do I need to show up with a document that says, okay, I've told you about this vulnerability and you acknowledge that you are not going to patch this and you were thereby taking responsibility for this?
Let's get to that point secondarily, because I think that is part of the story. But I want to push back a little bit on what you're saying. If our security tooling is saying this is a major vulnerability and the security tooling doesn't have the context of that vulnerability, whether it ultimately knows this software is deployed to the public internet or whether this software is just an internal thing that is relatively low risk, then it's the problem of the security tooling, to be honest. Like, it doesn't have the context to actually talk about the security risk that is involved. And maybe it's not the security tooling, maybe it's the security team that needs to bring in that context. But if, as a security team, you don't have the context about the concerns that you're raising, then I feel like you're probably not living up to what your actual role is. That said, really easy to do that. It's really easy to have that opinion. It's really hard to do that in the real world because of this spread of technology. We're always playing catch up. We can't be experts in everything. But to go back to your point, yeah, I think mature vulnerability management process needs to have this exception escape hatch where some VP or director says, you've explained the potential downsides of this thing. I fully accept that there could be a downside by not actioning this, but I'm making the decision to go forward and not address it. I think that mature process needs to have a whole bunch of other checks and controls in it. Like, you can't just have management going, yeah, that's fine, let's move on. Someone needs to be responsible at the end of the day. I think another core part of that is, how long are we going to carry this risk? I think it's reasonable to say, yeah, for the next 6 months, got these other priorities, let's revisit it in 6 months' time. So yeah, it's multiple aspects there.
So if you know that, do you put together a security incident team on standby because you know that vulnerability is going to get exploited, even though the person said that they'll take that risk? Or what is your level of responsibility to support that person?
Right. I wish it was always that clear. I wish it was that this thing is so bad that we've got a 50% chance in the next 6 months we're going to get hacked and we're going to lose customer data or financial dollars, real finance, real dollars. It's never that clear, though. It's very much often in the gray zone of you're telling me this is kind of a risk, but you can't really clearly talk to me about how that's going to happen or eventuate. But yeah, part of the security team is to be responsive and to clean up mess. I think that is the other part of mature security team's role.
One of our attendees is poking at an issue here, and I'm going to bring it up now because it kind of suggests that if you're a security professional, you want to think long and hard about the type of company you work for and where they operate, because to his point, larger organizations that have compliance requirements tend to, deal with these vulnerability issues a little more proactively than others. So does that factor into your thinking? Is there more to life than just, what's my salary and what's my number of day offs for the year?
That's a really interesting question because I've worked for big companies, including Google. I was head of security at Fitbit. I now work for a company that's 150 people. So I've seen both sides to that. And unfortunately, I feel like it's not, you can't judge a company by the size, the amount of people there. You can judge a company by how mature their technology stack is, how mature they are in terms of like their internal processes. Maybe compliance is a thing that you want to throw into the mix there. But ultimately, I think what the attendee is saying is like compliance is a big stick that is going to force vulnerabilities, red vulnerabilities, those high-risk vulnerabilities to be zero. Unfortunately, it's not a very nuanced stick, right? And then this is why compliance gets a bad rep, because compliance says fix all the things, and people involved in that process know that 50% of those things or some percentage of those things are not actual risks. But we're getting forced to do this by this greater compliance program, this greater regulatory thing. So there's not a lot of people struggle to get intrinsic motivation from being told the process says we do this, so you have to do it. On the flip side, yes, smaller companies that don't have that regulatory or that compliance sort of stick, it's a hard world to operate in. You're always going like, well, no one's forcing us to make this decision. We have to have some balance between figuring out like what are the real priorities, figuring out how we continue to make money because we're small, figuring out where we actually want to spend our time. So it's difficult. The short answer.
Last time I checked, compliance meant I achieved the bare minimum, right? So that's not necessarily the place to be.
Right. Exactly. I think like compliance is always, what's the cliche about like armies are always built to win the last war? I think compliance is very much like that. Compliance and regulatory bits and pieces are very much focused on, okay, we had this problem 10 years ago or 2 years ago. Let's go, make sure the companies are addressing that problem. It's not forward looking. It's not solving the things that probably people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So it is very much bare minimum. And worse, compliance can be stuck in this rut that is no longer applicable. I think the thing that always makes me laugh or frustrates me a little bit is compliance requirements that make you change a password every 30 days or whatever it is. You're like, well, I've got an MFA token. It's changing its password every 30 seconds. Changing passwords every 30 days is just going to mean that people write them down on sticky, yellow sticky pads and whatever else. So it's a real balance, like trying to figure out like the spirit of what compliance is trying to address, as well as figuring out what we also need to be worrying about.
Right. Plus, there's all those people who are using, 50 variations of the same password on the expectation that the bad guys won't be testing that theory.
I would say that if you've got a YubiKey, whereas I can't find mine here we go. Who cares if the bad guy knows my password, right? Like I've got a YubiKey. Unless they've got this as well, then it's kind of irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that always leaves me scratching my head a little bit, and maybe I'm doing this too long, but when I look at attack surface management, there's this cool little capability of we'll help you find everything that's been attached to your network so you can discover it and manage it. Last time I checked, the IT operations team typically had something that was, an asset management database, a CMDB, and theoretically you're supposed to know what we have already. So are these two functions converging, or are they complementary, or do we do that in the attack surface management because the CMDB is just never up to date and unreliable anyway?
Yeah. Once again, that last part, it may be starting with the last part. I mean, asset databases have always had a problem in that they're a representation of the ground reality that is somewhat disconnected from the ground reality, so you can never take them at 100% face value. But to talk about your other point, I think there's a few trends in the world and they're in technology, and they're not even new trends, which is software is eating the world. Like everything is software now. Software is a big part of our attack surface, and all of our physical assets are moving to the cloud. So it's no longer about racking routers and physical servers and data centers and filling up your MDF with equipment. It's about these nebulous cloud resources that are sitting in multiple AWS accounts with VMs and containers and EC2 images and whatever else. So they're the assets that are more and more counting. It's less and less about laptops and routers and closets and whatever else. So yeah, attack surface now, knowing what assets you've got out there, what data they've got, like how exposed they are, like what is the real risk is a really important part of security. And now the place that we're heading to is like all of those assets are intangible assets. Software, like first-party software, third-party software, like where is that software running? Like what containers? Is it production worthy? Is it production facing? Is it handling customer data? So we do need to have like a unified view of all of those assets. Obviously, you can't forget about laptops and all of the other things, but I think more and more it's those intangible assets that are important. And as humans, we don't really do well with intangible assets, right? Like it's easy to understand laptops and servers and routers. Very hard to understand like the 35,000 assets that are in this AWS account and what risk they pose to us.
What is the relationship between the security folks and the IT operations people going forward? It feels like it's evolving. Are they helping? Sometimes I feel like I'm watching a bad Western where the sheriff is like, there's been a robbery at the bank and we're going to deputize a posse and we're going to go out and fix this. But is that relationship getting better? Because we don't have enough security people, so we got to go deputize some folks, right?
Right, and I think it was like we were talking about vulnerability management earlier, and it's who are the asset owners? Are they actually responsible for securing their stuff? How do we hold them accountable there? How do we win friends and influence people in terms of making sure that they've carved out a part of their next month's worth of work to address the things that the security team are complaining about? In terms of IT and security, I think there's a lot of convergence there. I think if you started a business today, the IT team is not going to be rolling out network infrastructure and servers and routers. They're going to be deploying SaaS services and figuring out how to merge all these things and owning Slack configuration or whatever else. So all of those things still have security aspects to them. IT is very, like if you talk about the difference between IT and DevOps, I feel like there's a definite convergence there. IT is focused on the corporate SaaS services in a new business. It's not necessarily, I guess you still need to have physical laptops and things, but it's less and less about those physical aspects. And DevOps is focused on the assets that are being deployed to production and touching customer data. They're just two different parts of the business, but I think more and more it's just going to be managing cloud services and how to secure them. And security needs to work with those two sides of things, right? You can't just focus on production because your corporate assets can undermine it. You can't just focus on the corporate side of things because it turns out production is actually where customer data is.
We've been talking about this whole notion of DevSecOps for a while, and it's a lovely idea. You're going to shift more responsibility left towards the developers, who then immediately view the phrase shift left as roughly the equivalent of shifting everything downhill, and we know what else goes downhill. So the question becomes, how do we do that in a meaningful way? Because the developers will tell you the cognitive load is too high. I didn't have any cybersecurity training in the first place because it was an elective and nobody made me take it. So I didn't, I'm just doing my thing. So how do we kind of get in front of this to the point where, as one of our attendees notes, tomorrow's vulnerabilities are being written today?
Yeah, that's 100% true. There's two aspects to that, I feel like. I feel like as a security person, to go all the way back to your original question, which is what are we caring about today and what are we caring about tomorrow? Like, security people need to be more conversant with software. Like, I feel like maybe as an industry, we came from securing endpoints and deploying Splunk and running EDR, but I feel like more and more of the actual risk is in that software and those cloud environments. And as an industry, we just need to get more conversant in those things. So to be more in touch with what the developer workflows are, more conversant in what their day-to-day constraints are, more conversant in trying to teach them security and be on top of the things that they're doing and potentially the risks that they're creating. And then I feel like the other side of things is, that developer that didn't take the security elective and hasn't had any awareness training and things, unfortunately, you're going to have to do all of those things now. Like, in that previous world, we didn't say, you're a Windows administrator, it's fine not to understand security. That's not part of your job. We very much said, if you're configuring Active Directory, you need to be conversant in security and all the security mistakes that you can potentially make. And it's going to be the same way for developers. I feel like as a security team, doing that awareness, doing security training, helping whoever it may be, but it's developers or Active Directory administrators or whatever else, be conversant in the potential issues is a big part of our job. On the flip side, we can't solve all of security for these developers, and hence shift left. Like, they're the ones that know the software stack the best. They're the ones that are writing software, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, kind of a thing. So needs to be a partnership in terms of, like, they need to help us understand the things that they're doing. We need to help them consider security in their day-to-day workflows.
Right. In my experience, they're only writing code for 2 hours a day. They spend 6 hours a day managing the development environment, but that's a whole other issue. What's your sense of how do we get some more empathy going across this conversation? Because part of the issue, I think, is just developers don't see the pain. They don't feel it. They don't necessarily until there's a major crisis somewhere and somebody comes looking for them. But it doesn't feel like we're all kind of operating off the same page. And a lot of times the developers think the security people are something to be got around. And the security people think, developers are the root cause of every issue in the world.
Yeah, once again, I don't have any, maybe Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People is the thing we should all be reading, because it is honestly that, right? Like, going back to that compliance conversation, right? You can't just slap a developer with, this regulation says we have to clear all the red from this report. It's to be a little bit more humane and say, like, look, I know that half of these things are probably not going to impact us, but there's greater forces beyond you and I that are demanding that we address this report. And I think that sort of cascades down to every sort of daily interaction. I don't think security teams can just throw issues over the fence, because we know how that goes. I also don't feel like, but I also feel like asset owners, developers, whoever else, we can't just push all responsibility to them to run, to get a list of things and run it down. I think there needs to be a mature program of work that we've found these things. We can have a dialogue about, like, whether they impact us or not. Maybe the security team doesn't have the insight, but the developer can tell you that, no, honestly, this isn't a real thing. There is that process that you're talking about of, like, getting an exception, but they're humans and they're just trying to get their work done as well. But then again, the security team has all these things to worry about. It's not just whatever the developers are doing today. It's what the cloud team is doing today. It's like what the networking team is doing today. It's what the database team is doing today, and all these SaaS apps that IT might be rolling out as well. So we need to have a bit of respect for each other's pressures, I guess.
We have a question where somebody just wants to know, well, how do we gain visibility into all these assets that are out there? And how does that process work? I mean, who wakes up in the morning and says, I know, I'll just plug this into the corporate internet and see what happens?
Well, I think the security team, like those, we spoke about builders and breakers. I think the security team has an aspect of we need to be getting ahead of and architecting for minimizing risk. And if you stick something into the corporate network, if it's a zero trust network, who cares? It doesn't have privileged access to everything, which would be a nice world to live in. But yeah, on the cloud assets, on the software assets that are more and more the assets that contain the risk, the industry is still immature. We're still kind of figuring out how we get a unified view. Maybe there's a magic bullet out there, but I feel like there's no magic bullet that is going to look after your endpoints. It's going to look after your users, who's an asset, your employees, who are assets that we haven't spoken about yet. Who's going to look after all the accounts that each employee has access to across all the various SaaS services. And then you're talking about all the cloud infrastructure and all the software running on that cloud infrastructure. So it's a pretty intimidating problem to tackle. But like anything, I think in security, if you have an okay idea of where you're heading and where you're weak and where you're good, and you're generally making things.
All right. We have an interesting conversation going on across the chat session here. But basically, it's talking about how legacy systems are a problem. And one of our attendees is on the British side, I think. So they're calling it the legacy kit. But in my experience, at least, only about 3 to 5% of the vulnerabilities are being regularly exploited by the bad guys, and there's 97% more that they can play with that they just haven't gotten around to. So are we, in for proverbial bruising in the future? Because this is just the beginning. Jonathan, I think we're losing your audio there for a second. Well, anyway, I'll just keep on this topic till Jonathan figures that out. But all the studies that I have seen say it might get worse before it gets better, because the bad guys are going to start using more advanced scanning tools to find all this stuff. And the first thing they're going to do with AI is go look for more vulnerabilities. Jonathan, you back with us?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, the legacy kit thing is an interesting thing, right? Actually, maybe to go back to the previous attendee that was talking about, like, oh, big companies are great. Like they have got all these issues and they just address them because of compliance. Big companies have a lot of legacy kit that doesn't make sense financially to turn down. They need to get another 4, 5, 10 years out of that equipment. It would be really nice if you're a 10-person company and have got everything in Slack and zero trust networks and things. So I think legacy kit is an interesting thing. It's just a business decision. Like, we can't shut down all of these VMs running on physical servers in our data center today because they're making money, and the project to move them to the cloud would cost millions of dollars. So like anything, security is going to have to straddle both worlds, where we make sure that we're paying attention to the legacy kit and the risks that are there, as well as all the new stuff that are coming down the pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Is it
like there's this, to your point, that only 3% of vulnerabilities have only been taken advantage of, and there's potentially the rest of the 97%. I feel like that is more reflective of some things are exposed and highly exposed, and some things are not, and our tools are generally not smart enough to say, like, don't worry about this critical vulnerability on this internal service because there is no way to get access to it. I feel like the bad guys, they're not keeping 90% of the vulnerabilities in their back pocket for a rainy day. They're just automating these things, exploiting what they can. So I think we need to get better at providing context to the issues that we're talking to the business about. We need to get better at, like, really assessing risk as opposed to just like having tools that spit out a lot of noise. And they're tough questions.
Well, how do we assess the risk level? Because I think that is to your point. I think it was Frederick the Great said, he who defends everything defends nothing. And I feel like with cybersecurity, we're kind of in that bind right now. So how do we pick where to defend and based on what? And how do we know that we're making the right choice?
Yeah, if I had the actual answer to that, I'd go start up an insurance company and only insure the people that had a good answer. I don't know. The risk is a hard thing. I think as a discipline, we need to get better at it. There's a whole bunch of people looking at how we can, prediction markets and really doing, going back to insurance, like insurance has got risk down pat. Like if you're an actuary, you have a pretty good set of tools to be like, well, this seems bad, but the incident rate is such, and all of our data historically has said why that we'll probably make money on this if we insure it. Security industry is not there, and maybe we can never get there because cybersecurity has to chase that technological progress kind of a thing. But we, as an industry, we definitely need to get better at talking about risk. It's not CVSS score is 10 on this piece of infrastructure. Need to fix it. It's CVSS score is 10 on this, and we've confirmed that this is a real vulnerability that applies to the context that this thing is, and it's touching customer data or otherwise exposed, and we have a much better and nuanced ability to say like, no, there is real risk here, as opposed to this finding is red and therefore you must fix it. I don't know how we get there. We just get better, we get more mature.
Do you think regulations are going to force the issue? It seems like they're becoming more prescriptive in their requirements, and maybe they don't really understand what goes into fulfilling those requirements. But sometimes I feel like, basically they're throwing up their hands and they're saying, we are unable to protect you, so therefore you should not go to that bad part of town and you should not be out after 10 o'clock.
I'm skeptical. We mentioned it earlier. Armies are always built to win the last war. I feel like regulatory things are always built to solve the last problem. I feel like they might, if there's more, well, I think a good relevant example at the moment is the SEC suing SolarWinds, and particularly the CISO, Tim Brown, for the massive hack recently. That's somewhat concerning, but also maybe that's going to change the appetite in terms of like security teams will say, no, previously we had this, we said this was a real issue. We really dug in and the VP signed off on it as being something that we would live with. I feel like if CISOs and security teams are not necessarily going to jail, but like being sued, for the things that they're meant to be responsible for, but ultimately have no ability to control, that's going to change the dialogue a little bit. I think it will be like, no, you might want to sign off on this, but we're really going to have to spend like this amount of money to fix this issue. We can't move forward. We can't deploy the next product until you do, because you signing off on that thing is not just a piece of paper that goes nowhere. It's the SEC is going to come along if we get hacked and sue you, and you'll never be able to be a VP of a fun company again, kind of a thing. So that would be interesting. It's not kind of the world that we really love to operate in, right? Like we want to be having a little bit more of a back and forth of a dialogue, saying like, we should do this. This is a good strategic thing to do. Also, it's going to cost a little bit more money, as opposed to, these guys are going to sue us if we don't do it.
Mm-hmm. Who is ultimately responsible? Because it's not like the security people have a lot of control over the vulnerabilities, and yet they're getting blamed. And I kind of feel like, we're trying to hold the fire chief responsible for every fire that happened in town, and it's not reasonable.
No, I don't think it is either. We agree. We should write a letter to the SEC in support of. I think it's a tough one, right? Like we're not operationally responsible in that SolarWinds case. Some of the things that SEC were raising were the VPN, anyone could log on to their VPN with a username and password. They weren't doing device attestation. They weren't doing MFA. There was instances where passwords were weak, even though their password policy said it should be a certain complexity, et cetera, et cetera. I ultimately was the security team in charge of configuring the VPN. Was it in charge of configuring whatever router had that weak password? No. There was another party responsible there, and it's, as security professionals, we've always had that conversation about it, like, hey, we found a security issue, you need to fix it, and it hasn't been fixed in the amount of time that we allotted to it. I don't know how we solve that. Well, one of the solutions there is we shift left. The security team is here to be like an advisory oversight. We're going to try and fix some things and get rid of some vulnerability classes, but ultimately developers or asset owners are in charge of security. I think that's probably the only way that we solve this problem. If you know and configure and have the budget for a system, then you are responsible for the security of that system. I don't think there's another way forward.
How do we have that conversation with the business, which is already a difficult conversation? They don't really always understand the language being used. They conflate IT and security in the first place. And it also seems to me that maybe we don't understand enough that they do think in terms of risk. But to them, it's the rewards outweigh the potential damage, because they're looking at an app saying, yeah, well, we may get hacked, but we're going to make $500,000 in the next 6 months, hopefully before that happens.
I think security people need to be more conversant with risk, like we've spoken about, but also with business drivers. It kind of sucks, but I think if there's a risk of 5% risk of something happening in 2 years' time, and we expect that we'll remove, completely rewrite it again in 2 years' time, maybe that's an okay decision to make. But I feel like these conversations and these decisions are not actually happening. I feel like most of the time it's ignoring what IT are saying because they don't talk our language, taking on risk that if you actually had an idea of the true underlying outcomes and likelihoods, you'd probably not choose to do that. So I think both sides need to meet in the middle a little bit more.
Not everybody watching this is in the same place in terms of their career. And I would take a look at you and I would say, well, you don't look overly stressed. You've got all your hair. So what do you know now that you wish you knew when you first started out, and what makes it easier for you to sleep at night, assuming you are?
Don't get me wrong, all of these conversations that we've been talking about are daily conversations that we have. Being a security lead is never a super pleasurable place to be. But on the flip side, I think going back to your attendee that was talking about big companies versus small companies, and as a security person, who do you want to work for? I would say that the actual question there is, do you feel like this company cares about security? Do you feel like the company has the appetite and the budget and the resources to to actually make a difference and keep moving forward? I think the worst place you can be as a security professional is at a big or small company that doesn't care about security and that there's no day-to-day sort of improvement. There's no ability to affect change. So I feel like that's completely disconnected from whether the company is big or small. So I think that's my number one tip. Like make sure you land at a place where you can have an impact and you can see all the effort that you're putting in and all those sleepless nights and the gray hairs that you're earning are actually contributing to the company. It's valued and you're making forward progress. That's very much. And the other thing I feel like from a security point of view is we need to keep a little bit of a sense of humor about ourselves and the job, because it can be pretty. As a security person, you can often be the grumpy person in the corner saying no, this is terrible, the sky's falling. I think a good way to deal with that is to A, have a bit more of a broader view, and B, not take yourselves too seriously.
I once heard a business executive joke that, if his security people had been around during the invention of the phone, they would have told them, be careful not to use it. Some information might get out. So, the business people are kind of.
I think that was a really look at SMSs today, and all of us who have got aged parents that are getting conned into having taken advantage of the phone, having pseudo fake Microsoft support people call them up and say just install this piece of software. So I think that's a very valid. I think it would have been great to have a security person in the room with Graham Bell, and he could have said, or she could have said. There's some risks that go along with this, and maybe we might have got to a better place eventually. That said, I don't think it was a good decision. It would have been a good decision to shut the whole project down.
We hear a lot about AI, and we touched upon it earlier, but from a cybersecurity perspective, do you think AI might save us from ourselves? Do we have more to gain than we might lose? What's your assessment?
Well, after the weekend, in all the drama that's happened at OpenAI, I don't think AI can save itself from AI, to be honest. That whole industry is in a bit of flux. But more seriously, I feel like AI is the buzzword at the moment. It's mainly off the back of large language models. Maybe this is a depressing thing, but there's probably limited opportunity for large language models to improve security. I think they're really good at text. Semgrep ourselves have been, code at the end of the day is text. We've done some fun things around using large language models to spot false positives, to make suggested fixes, auto fixes, and there's some other very specific use cases where text-based large language models do really well in security. I guess like DLP, if you're trying to detect sensitive data going out through email, or you're trying to detect spam, I think they're probably two good use cases. In terms of attack surface, understanding lots of log data, trying to understand lots of metrics coming from endpoints, I don't think large language models are really going to help us. I also feel like there's a whole bunch of security companies that are going but we're machine learning. We've been doing AI for a long time. Why is our share price not as much as shooting up like everybody else's? So I think security is still going to invest in, I think, machine learning or AI in general. I feel like the current hype is going to have very specific, but maybe not as much impact on the security industry in general. Hopefully, whatever the next AI buzzword thing is, maybe that's going to help us. And maybe on a slightly depressing front, the current large language models might have worse impact on security, right? They're very focused on text. They can sound very authoritarian. Plugging that into a phishing campaign and trying to convince your less technical family members to send money overseas is probably going to pay off more than trying to plug large language models into your AV or whatever your other security tooling is. So I feel like it gives the current the current buzzwords in AI probably also got uses for the bad guys as well.
And to make matters even more interesting, some of those LLMs are general purpose LLMs, and they hoovered code from everywhere they could find in the web, and the code is of varying quality. And guess what? There's vulnerabilities in the code being generated by the machines, and you may find that in a production environment someday soon near you, and there's going to be a lot more of it, right? So, we're kind of damned if we do and damned if we don't here.
Yeah, very much so. Although, like everything in security, this is probably going to make yesterday's mistakes, faster and bigger. But yesterday you could go to Stack Overflow and copy some code that had terrible mistakes in it. Today it's just going to be straight in your IDE. It's going to spit out the code without you even having to go and copy it from Stack Overflow. But it's the same underlying concern, and developers need to be, and the same underlying fixes. Developers need to be aware of security. You need to have security tooling. You need to develop workflows. And the security team needs to understand those developer workflows as well.
All right. We have one question here that you kind of touched on, but I want to get a little more pointed answer about it. What is the ethical responsibility of cybersecurity professionals when they know that there's a vulnerability that's likely to be exploited? And does that vary based on the use case, or is it their obligation to their company to support them? And it's the CEO's job to figure out what the requirements are for disclosure.
Yeah, well, I feel like that the SEC thing is very much fighting that whole question in the public. The SolarWinds SEC thing is very much asking that question. That the SEC is saying that the CISO has the ultimate responsibility for the security of the company. There was market disclosures saying like we're all good, even though the CISO was in sort of more backroom or internal meetings saying like we've got all these problems. So the SEC is saying, from our point of view, that you've got a chief executive or a senior executive that is responsible for these things. I feel like 6 months ago, the answer would have been, the security people would have said, like, we can only do so much. We can try and very clearly articulate what the actual risk is, but ultimately it is a business decision, and it has to roll up to the CEO or others. So I feel like there's two very divergent views here. I guess we'll find out, and it could change the industry. But I feel like from an ethical point of view, like trying to make it very much more day-to-day for a security person, is we need to understand the risks. We need to be very clear about them and have some nuance in talking to the asset owners or the technology owners, right? Like, it can't just be tool says high risk, therefore you must fix. I think it must be like, tool says high risk, what's the actual applicability? Is this tool, does the tool have all the context? Trying to really be clear about that risk and communicate it in a way to the business owners that they can understand. And that's the best that we can do. Like, no, really, this is a real risk. Here's what the potential outcome is. Like, let's have a mature discussion about the pros and cons of not addressing this. I think that's all we can do at the moment. And unfortunately, that means we have to do that for every vulnerability across every system, across like all the various different parts of the business. It's a big job.
All right, we're down to the last couple of minutes, but I do want to ask this one question. With increased responsibility, does that mean a bigger paycheck?
Well, it's an interesting question, actually, because there's two outcomes. Bigger paycheck because you've got the potential for the SEC to sue you, and it's an important part of the business. Or then you create a market. Everyone who if that doesn't happen, people are like, well, that's a sucker's game. I'm a technically competent person. I'm just going to go out and be an engineer, and then I won't be sued. And then you'll get a worse outcome. I think people will just be, keeping bums in seats and not necessarily technically competent. So potentially, I guess it would be good. I think we already demand a premium as it is. So. All
right, folks. Well, the coming year promises to be extraordinarily interesting. Jonathan, thanks for chatting with me.
It was a pleasure to talk, Mike.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.